Today's story, The Witch's Gold, written by William J.M. McQueen. The winter had been harsh that year, and old Jess Cutter's aching bones were welcoming the warmer climate. Another year had come and gone, and he found himself another year older. What year was it now? Jess could not recall. 18-something, he reckoned. As far as his age was concerned, he had lost track. Still, he could not help but notice that his long hair and whiskers had gotten a bit whiter. Yep, another year had come and gone, and beavers were getting scarce. Pickings had been mighty slim in recent memory, and he was much the poorer for it. Younger trappers had encroached upon his territory and had effectively pushed him out, so Jess set out in search of new trapping grounds. Fewer folks were buying fur these days. Silk was the new thing, leaving an old fossil like Jess to fret over what to do in the coming days. He thought about becoming a wagon train guide or scouting for the U.S. Army, but neither prospect held much appeal for him. He was a trapper and was probably going to be one until the end of his days. Jess rode his horse, Jake, and led his pack horse, Manuelito, through the rocky hills down toward Dark Walker Valley. He had been hearing a lot of peculiar tales about that valley, many too outlandish to be believed. But it seemed that folks tended to avoid that lush territory with its running stream, and that suited him just fine. Less folks to poke around in his business and get in his way. If the rumors he had been hearing were true, and people were choosing to stay away from that particular valley, then his decision to make the long journey was a good one. It could open up a whole new series of opportunities for him. There it was. After several days of hard travel, the feared valley lay just below him, green and inviting. The flourishing landscape ahead was a sharp contrast to the snow-capped mountains behind him. The warm sense of larkspur and columbine wafted from the verdant fields and conjured memories of days long past. But there were certain memories Jess tried desperately to force out of his mind. Periodically, those painful recalls tore at his heart and soul, leaving him crushed and drained of mind and spirit. Those remembrances usually centered around his beloved Agnes. She used to love the smell of wildflowers on a spring day. Both she and Jess were young once upon a time, and they were pretty eager to take on the world in those days. He was strong and hardworking, and he promised his beloved new bride so much. Yearning to begin their new life together, they settled in Colorado. She was a schoolteacher, and he was a farmer, and at first everything seemed to go their way. It all seemed so perfect. Of course, there were difficulties, as two people learned to live with one another, but their love overcame all obstacles. That was about the time his obsession began to take hold. He became so focused on building his fortune that it tended to blind him to the truly important things in life, and it was his poor, sweet Agnes who suffered because of it. She became terribly unhappy. Storms and drought came in the years that followed, disasters which ruined his crops. His credit was gone, and he ended up in debt to the bank, and Mother Nature remained unrelenting. Jess became miserably depressed, and he and Agnes began arguing all of the time. He coped with it by going out to the barn and getting drunk. That was when his sweet Agnes came down with the influenza. He stood by and helplessly watched as each day she got weaker, until one day she went to sleep and never woke up. Now she rests with her Lord forever. Jess's spirit broke, and he lost his heart and will that day. He was unable to continue with life after she died. He was ashamed of his actions and behavior, and he was never able to forgive himself for his sweet Agnes dying alone and unhappy. In the days that followed, he discovered that he could not stay in the house. There were too many painful memories. He packed some supplies and headed for the hills, and he has not looked back since. Now he sat and looked down at the green valley through misty eyes. He hoped his future lay ahead, because he simply had nowhere else to go. Dark Walker Valley was almost too beautiful to be believed. It appeared quite contrary to the spooky tales that folks tended to tell in these parts. Stories of spooks, strange beasts, and mysterious occurrences. It was all pretty far-fetched. So far, nothing of an unearthly nature came into sight. But it was getting late, and he had to find a place to make camp for the night. He directed Jake and Manuelito to a rocky hill just north of the valley floor. If his memory served him right, that place was called Rattler's Ridge, and it seemed a decent enough place to lay his weary head. The waxing moon lit the occasional cloud that lazily drifted across the starry sky. Jess had a cozy fire crackling, and Jake and Manuelito were quiet and seemed grateful for the rest. Jess was busy devouring the last bit of rabbit meat from a bone. His greasy whiskers glistened in the firelight. After wiping his hands clean on his clothing, he took a couple more swallows of coffee and bedded down for the night. The stars sparkled brightly in the dark sky, and Jess was just about to drift off to sleep when he heard something. It was a rustling of some sort, soft and low, almost impossible to hear. But it was there nevertheless. The horses fidgeted nervously, and Jess kept his hand ready on his knife as he peered into the darkness to see what was there. He lay perfectly still, watching and waiting, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But he could not see anything. Something was out there, that much he was sure of, and whatever it was moving around his camp. Several minutes passed, and whatever it was went away, and that was just fine by him. He waited a while longer until the horses settled down. He knew he was safe for now. He tried to sleep again when a howling echoed from somewhere in the distance. It was not a wolf or a coyote. It was something he had never heard before, and it gave him chills. For the rest of the night, he kept his long rifle close. The next morning was a cheerful and welcome sight. The sun shone invitingly upon the terrain. Even the horses seemed relieved. Jess looked around the perimeter of his camp, curiously looking for tracks. He wanted to know exactly what it was that circled his camp during the night. But strangely, there were no tracks to be found. Even the tiniest of animals leaves tracks if you know what you're looking for, and Jess had honed his tracking skills long ago. Still, he could not find anything, not a single sign. It was almost as if nothing had been there, but he knew better. It was a most peculiar situation, and he puzzled over it in his brain until he realized it was doing no good, so he pushed it out of his mind. He set about packing his gear and carefully loaded everything upon Manuelito. He was nearly finished when something caught his attention. A sparkle of sunlight came from some rocks and caught the corner of his eye. He turned to see what it was. He could not tell what was causing it at first glance, but something within those very large rocks made the sunlight shine back at him. He walked closer to get a better look, and what he saw upon closer inspection nearly caused his heart to stop. He ran his hands over it to see if it was real. Could it be? Jess rushed to Manuelito and removed his pickaxe, then went back to the sparkling rock. A few good whacks with the pickaxe and a chunk broke free. Jess picked it up, studied it, scratched at it, and even tasted it. Sure enough, the shiny yellowish vein that ran through the stone was indeed gold. Jess clutched that chunk of stone and stared at it as if mesmerized. "I can't believe it!" Old Jess looked at the hole he cut into the large rock and saw that the vein ran deep into it. Jess was elated, gave a happy yell, and began to dance a joyful jig right there on the hill. The horses watched as he laughed and hollered. His voice echoed all across the valley below and drew the attention of a large group of blackbirds that took to the sky. 2 weeks had passed, and Jess made the journey to the town of Willow Grove. A few onlookers observed him as the mountain man rode along Main Street, leading poor Manuelito, who was burdened with several large and obviously heavy canvas sacks. Jess wasted no time and went straight to the assay office. The assay clerk also happened to be Clem the barber. There had not been a need for assay services in many a year, and it had been a slow day for cutting hair, so Clem closed up shop and decided to do some fishing. He was seated at his desk, working on a spoon lure, when the front door opened. Clem was not too happy when Jess walked in, carrying several of the heavy canvas sacks. In fact, the old man had to make a couple of trips, laying sacks around the room. Jess was dirty and smelled like a noxious combination of old bear and skunk. Clem briefly paused the work on his lure. "May I help you?" "Yes, sirree. You bet your buttons you can." Jess dropped 3 of the sacks onto the desk. One of them fell to the floor with a heavy thud. "I got me this here gold." Clem incredulously raised an eyebrow and peered over his spectacles. "Gold? There hasn't been any gold in these parts for near 30 years. Jess opened one of the sacks of bullion for Clem to inspect. "These ain't no sacks of flour, sonny." Clem handled the raw ore with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "It appears to be gold. It must be tested, of course." Jess smiled. "Do what you gotta. There's plenty more where that come from." "More, you say?" "I'm gonna file me a claim. Then I'm gonna dig me a mine." Clem continued to study the contents of the sack. "Where exactly is this wellspring of yours?" "Southeast of here a ways, over at Rattler's Ridge, near Dark Walker Valley." Clem's face turned white, and he dropped the gold he was holding. "Over where?" "Out near Dark Walker Valley." Clem backed away in near panic. "Oh, no. I'm sorry, mister. I'm afraid I can't help you." Jess was confused. "Why in tarnation not?" "Don't you know the things folks say about that place? It's not safe there. It's cursed, and I'm pretty dang sure that anything coming out of there is cursed too." Jess smiled a big yellow-toothed grin as he held up a chunk of gold. "Does this look cursed to you? I ain't gonna let a few crazy stories dictate what I'm gonna do in life. The gold is there, and it's a huge blessing to my miserable life. Cursed? We should all be so cursed. This gold is the first good thing to happen to me in many a year." Jess opened more sacks of gold so Clem could get a good look. "When's the last time something like this come through these parts? Gold makes folks rich. Ain't that worth taking a chance or two? Clem found himself unable to resist the gold's allure. He stepped closer and stared at the sacks and their contents. Jess knew he had him. You just worry about the gold and let me deal with the ghosties and goblins. Clem studied a hunk of gold and looked at all of the sacks Jess brought in. I'm gonna have to test all this. There'll be a fee, of course. Of course. Jess's smile widened. And then you can tell me just how much I'll be getting for all this here gold. Over the months that followed, Jess built himself a cabin and barn down in the valley by the stream, and had begun to dig a mine up in the hills. During that time, old Jess brought more gold into Willow Grove, leaving a wealthier man than he had ever been in his life. He finally made his fortune, but sweet Agnes was not there to share it with him. Jess tried not to dwell on such sad thoughts. He had to push it all out of his mind and go on about his work. He just hoped the good Lord allowed Agnes to look down from above, and he hoped that his dear Agnes was smiling down at him. He also hoped she might find it in her heart and soul to forgive him for his past behavior and bad choices toward her in life. That way, he would not feel so alone, that he could finally share with her all of the things he could not share when she was alive. Those thoughts gave him the strength to carry on. One day, while Jess was outside of his cabin chopping wood, he received his first visitor. A strange man in a creepy horse and buggy rode along the dirt path and stopped nearby. The stranger was a tall, gaunt, well-dressed man who had on some fancy yet unusual garments. He had all the appearance of a dandy undertaker. "Hello," the man greeted in a voice that made Jess's skin crawl. Jess stopped chopping and wiped his forehead with a dusty old rag. "Howdy, stranger." The man stepped out of the buggy and extended his hand in greeting. "You must be Mr. Cutter." "That'd be me." Jess shook the man's hand, which was quite cold to the touch. Jess wiped his hand on his trousers to get rid of the lingering clammy sensation. "Allow me to introduce myself," the man said. "I am Silas Gravestone, and I represent someone who has taken an active interest in your, shall we say, recent activities?" "You don't say." "Yes, indeed." Gravestone looked around at Jess's cabin and property. "You've been busy and have built quite a home here." "It's coming along. Still got a few things to tend to before I'm through." "It must be expensive," Gravestone remarked. "And just how are you paying for all of this?" Jess looked the man straight in the eye. "Let's just say that the Lord has been good to me." Gravestone gave a small smile. "Divine Providence wouldn't have anything to do with the gold you're removing from that hillside, would it?" he asked while pointing in the direction of the mine. Jess became defensive and gripped the axe handle more tightly. "So what if I am? What's it to you?" "As I said, I represent someone who has become most interested in recent activities, especially your theft of her gold." That statement caught Jess off guard. "Me? A thief? I never stole nothing from nobody. That there gold was found by me and a legal claim was filed with the government of these here United States. It's all legal and proper. It's mine." Gravestone slowly shook his head. "No, it's not." "Would you mind explaining that real careful like?" "Not at all." Gravestone spoke calmly with just a hint of menace. "You see, Mr. Cutter, Selbrua, the witch who owns this valley and certain surrounding territories, is very displeased with you. You entered her domain without permission, yet she allowed you safe passage. But you did not leave. In fact, you decided to build a home here, and then you wound the land by digging that mine and removing its gold." Jess became red with anger. "I filed a mining claim on that there hill, which means that I can dig it and pull whatever I gall darn well please out of it." "Except this is not public land. The domain and everything contained therein is her property, including your gold." "Well, that's just sour pickles, ain't it?" Jess spat his chewing tobacco at Gravestone's feet. "I'm here to stay, so I suggest she become more neighborly so as to not get me all riled." Gravestone took a deep breath. "Mr. Cutter, I don't think you're grasping the situation, so let me make this perfectly clear. Selbrua wants you to return all of her gold, or she will punish you." Jess raised his axe to chest level and stepped forward. "Are you threatening me, Sonny?" "Not at all." Gravestone's face became eerily serious. "I'm simply relaying the message. What you do from this moment onward is entirely up to you. Just bear in mind that you must live with the consequences of your choices." "You look here, Mr. Fancy Breeches. I don't care who you are or what you say. I don't scare easy. I've endured the worst Mother Nature could throw at me, and I survived bears, mountain lions, rattlers, wolves, and Martin Van Buren. So don't go telling me that some witch is gonna do me in." Gravestone gave a wicked little smile. "I believe you finally have a grasp on the situation. Yes, indeed." Jess hefted the axe in a threatening manner. "Mister, I don't know who you are with all your fancy talk and all, but I'm going to give you just 1 minute to get off my property. I've kept my manners till now, but you done wore off your welcome. That's my gold I'm taking out of that there mine, and I intend to keep it. Now get!" "Very well." Gravestone appeared quite calm as he slowly returned to his horse and buggy. Jess had not noticed before, but a lot of black birds seemed to linger about. Gravestone climbed into his buggy, but before he rode away, he looked at Jess once more. "Do as you wish, Mr. Cutter. You've been warned. But know this, greed is a terrible thing. It will end up being the death of you." Gravestone grabbed the reins, clicked his tongue, and drove his buggy back in the direction from which he came. The blackbirds took flight and appeared to follow him. Jess stood there and watched until the buggy was out of sight. "Witches," he muttered to himself. "Bah!" He looked up at the sky. "I swear, Agnes," he said to the empty air, "what will gold thieves think of next? Imagine 'em harassing decent folks like that, trying to scare 'em off their own property." Jess put down his axe and carried some firewood into his cabin. "Witches, bah! Any witch shows up round here, I'll give 'em what for. Yes, sirree." He closed the door behind him without having seen the blackbirds sitting in the branches of nearby trees. They heard what he said and continued to stare at the cabin, their dark eyes watching, always watching. Later that night, Jess sat at his table and enjoyed a hot bowl of rabbit stew. The fire crackled warmly in the fireplace, and Jess could hear the wind blowing outside. "Storm must be blowing in," he thought. He also realized he had better check on the horses after he finished his supper. Before long, however, the wind had become quite fierce, and he thought he heard his name being carried through the rising storm. Just his imagination, he thought. Rocks and dirt were blown against the side of the cabin, and the front door appeared ready to blow in. Jess had not seen a squall like that since he dodged that twister in Kentucky. Lightning flashed through the windows, and thunder shook the ground. "Cutter!" That was not his imagination. He heard that. A woman's voice called his name. "Jesse Elijah Cutter!" The voice from outside shouted over the wind. Jess did not know what was going on, so he grabbed his rifle and opened the front door. The howling wind nearly knocked him down. Shielding his eyes against the barrage of dust and dirt, he tried to peer into the darkness. He could not see a thing in the murky night, but then lightning flashed and lit up the countryside. That was when Jess saw something that made his blood turn cold. High in the sky, amidst the storm clouds, was a woman suspended in midair. "I've come for you, Cutter!" she screamed, followed by a cackling laughter. Startled, Jess stumbled backward and tripped over a chair, falling hard to the floor. He could see through the open doorway that the woman was coming down from the sky and was approaching his cabin. Jess quickly picked himself up and grabbed his rifle. With practiced speed, he loaded the weapon, swung it around toward the woman, and fired. The shot had no effect on her. The woman laughed, raised her arms, and sent 2 bolts of lightning from her hands straight at the old man. The impact threw Jess hard against the back wall of the cabin. Gasping for air, Jess looked up as the laughing woman glided through the doorway and landed next to his table. She was short and plump, with dark, stringy hair laced with streaks of white. She wore a gray gown made from some sort of heavy material. Her black cloak whipped around in the wind. "Good evening, Mr. Cutter." "Let me guess," he said as he picked himself up off the floor. "You must be Selbrua." "Oh," the woman said in mock flattery. "You've heard of me." "Your name came up a time or two." Selbrua looked around the cabin. "Nice place. It should be. It cost me enough." "So what is it you want?" Selbrua was surprised by the question. "Did you not receive a visit from Silas Gravestone this afternoon?" "Yes." "And did he not give you a message from me?" "He did." Selbrua stared at Jess expectantly. "And?" "And what?" Jess asked indignantly, his fear disappearing. "You folks are trying to swindle me out of my gold, and you're being quite ornery about it." "My gold," Selbrua declared angrily. "Never forget that." Jess stood there smugly. "Finders keepers, lady." Selbrua looked contemptuously at the old man. "Why, you greedy little toad. You feel absolutely no regret or remorse for robbing me of what's mine, do you?" "What do you want me to say, lady?" Jess picked up a couple of fallen items and straightened a toppled chair. "You come in here flashing a few parlor tricks and expect to scare me into handing you my gold? It ain't gonna work. That gold is mine, see? It's all mine, mine, mine. And that's how it's gonna stay." Selbrua studied the man coolly. "Gold fever is in your blood, isn't it? Coursing through your veins." "I don't mean to be rude," Jess said as he attempted to usher her to the door. "But get out of my house. You're not welcome here." "You're a contemptible man, Cutter, but I'm going to give you one last chance to save yourself. Return all of the gold you have taken from this place and be on your way. Never return. You do this, and I will let you leave in peace." "No, I don't think so," Jess confronted her. "I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to get off my property before I forget I'm a gentleman and throw you out." Selbrua was unimpressed. "I see." "So hop on your broomstick or whatever and get out, now." "Yes, indeed," she said thoughtfully. "Gold is in your blood." She stretched out her hand toward Jess. "But why stop there?" Selbrua began to mutter words that made no sense to Jess, and he began to feel peculiar, strange sensations that radiated through his body, and the room began to spin. Jess lost consciousness. The last thing he heard was Selbrua's cackling laughter. Jess awoke the next morning to the sun shining on his face. The storm clouds had gone, and sunlight was streaming through the window. He was on the floor. Some personal items were strewn about. He tried to sit up, but he felt heavy and weak. His head felt out of sorts, but he mustered the strength to stand. He plopped himself into a chair, which fell apart beneath him. The chair simply broke as if crushed by a great weight. Confused, and with great effort, he picked himself up again. He found it difficult to stand, so he leaned on the edge of the still open doorway. He did not know exactly what that woman did to him, but he thought that he should go see a doctor. He staggered outside, and with a lot of difficulty, managed to hitch Jake to the buckboard. The wagon creaked and cracked as he climbed onto it. He carefully sat down and grabbed the reins. Just then, the buckboard broke beneath him. There was no way he could possibly ride it into town now. Climbing out of the wreckage of his wagon, he carefully unhitched Jake, led the horse to the barn, and saddled him. Jake, however, protested quite profusely when Jess tried to mount up. In fact, Jake galloped away and abandoned the old man. Jess felt terrible and realized that he had no choice but to walk those many miles to Willow Grove. Summoning whatever strength remained, Jess began the hard, slow walk to town. It was nearly sundown when Jess finally arrived at Willow Grove. He had all the appearance of a drunkard as he staggered and stumbled along the main street. Men and women went about their business and paid him little mind. Jess was dirty, sweaty, and was about to drop from exhaustion. With panting breath, he asked a man where the doctor was, and the man pointed to a small building between the sheriff and the saloon. The sign out front read, Dr. Horace Adams, M.D. "Much obliged," Jess said to the stranger, then stumbled his way toward the building. Inside of the doctor's office, oil lamps were lit against the growing darkness. Doc Adams was at his desk, writing a letter to a colleague when the front door opened and Jess stepped inside. Doc Adams removed his spectacles and looked at the disheveled old man. "Can I help you?" "You the doc?" "Doc Adams, that's me." The doctor helped the exhausted Jess to a chair. "Take it easy now. That's it. Sit right there." The chair broke beneath the old man, and Jess fell to the floor with a tremendous thud. He even cracked the wooden floor. The doc was startled. "Whoa, old-timer, you all right?" "I don't reckon so." Jess allowed the doctor to help him up, but the doctor was having difficulty with Jess's tremendous weight. "Something's been wrong with me since this morning." Jess finally got to his feet. "I've been feeling heavy and out of sorts." The doctor stepped outside of the building's back door and returned carrying his wood chopping block. Doc set it down and carefully sat Jess on it. The floor creaked beneath him, but everything seemed fine. Doc was satisfied. "There now, that should hold you." Once down, Jess began to catch his breath. "Thank you kindly. It's been a mighty long walk to town." Doc Adams wheeled his desk chair around and sat, facing Jess. "So, what seems to be the matter?" "Damned if I know, Doc." Jess pulled an old rag from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his pale face. "Everything was fine last night till that woman came round my place." "A woman, huh? What did she want?" "I got myself a mine I'm digging out near Rattler's Ridge. This woman turns up, says I'm stealing her gold and wants me to put it all back. Says she'll get me if I don't." Doc eyed Jess wearily. "Where do you say this mine was?" "Out near Rattler's Ridge over yonder by Darkwalker Valley." Doc was visibly nervous as he listened to Jess's tale. "Salbrua? You know her?" Doc grabbed a stethoscope and returned to the old man. "Everyone in these parts knows of Salbrua. and everyone knows to steer clear of her. She's dangerous." "Yeah, well, if she's really a witch like they say, she put some sort of a whammy on me." "Well, let's take a listen." Doc used the stethoscope and tried to listen to Jess's heart. Something was not right. His heart sounded wrong. "What the?" Jess was concerned. "What's the matter, Doc? What is it?" Doc tried to listen to Jess's breathing, but that too sounded wrong. Doc put down the stethoscope and put his ear to Jess's chest. Still wrong. Doc took Jess's wrist and intended to take the old man's pulse, but something felt wrong about the arm as well. A man's wrist is normally soft and fleshy. Jess's arm felt as if he had sand beneath the skin. Doc sat back, quite confused. "Tell me, Doc," Jess was frantic. "What's the matter with me?" "This beats me." Doc was unsure of what to do next. Then a thought occurred to him, and he grabbed a scalpel. After pouring some whiskey on the blade, Doc took Jess's hand. It too had that sandy feeling. "I want to take a blood sample. I'm just going to prick your finger, all right?" "Do what you gotta, Doc." Doc Adams chose a finger on Jess's hand and prepared to poke the tip with the scalpel. "This is going to sting a bit." Doc cut the tip of Jess's finger and was surprised that there was no blood. Jess fidgeted nervously. "Whenever you're ready, Doc." "I've already cut your finger," Doc informed him. "Didn't you feel that?" "Nope, not a thing." Doc Adams was curious and cut the finger further. "How about now?" "Still nothing." There was still that peculiar absence of blood, and when Doc turned Jess's hand upside down, a yellowish, powdery, particulate substance fell from the cut finger to the floor. "Gold dust?" Doc was astonished. "What?" Jess yanked his hand back and watched as the sparkling dust poured from his finger. "Doc, what's going on?" Jess jumped up from the chopping block, causing Doc Adams to accidentally slice the old man's leg. Gold dust poured from the open wound. Doc became very upset. "I'm terribly sorry." Jess did not feel a thing and did not know that his leg was cut. The old man was in a state of panic, but Doc was able to calm him some and managed to get the man to sit back down. Doc opened Jess's shirt and cut away the front of the old man's long underwear. Doc took the scalpel and, starting at the base of the neck, sliced Jess's chest open all the way to his navel. Gold dust poured from the incision. Using both hands, the doctor reached into the incision and pulled the man open. What Doc discovered was horrifying. All of Jess's bones and internal organs had turned to gold. "Oh, dear God!" Doc screamed in terror as he fled the building. "No! No!" Jess was nearly hysterical. "Help me, Doc! Please! Don't go! Doc, please help me!" The petrified doctor never returned, leaving Jess to sit there all alone, splayed open for all the world to see. The soft glow of the oil lamps reflected eerily upon the old man's innards, and the frightened, miserable, and very lonely Jess Cutter began to cry. A few days later, a monster roamed the streets and back alleys of Willow Grove. Jesse Elijah Cutter had turned completely to gold, hair and all. He trudged along, crying out in a voice no longer human, begging for help. Some unscrupulous individuals happened to be lingering around the saloon when Jess came up the street. One of them, a foul-looking man named Johnny, watched Jess with fascination. Then he had an idea. He and his boys waited for Jess to walk closer. Then Johnny nodded to the boys, who went around to the back of the building. Johnny just stood there, smoking his cigarette and waited for Jess to get even closer. "Help me! Someone, please, help me!" Jess cried out in his metallic, vibrating voice. Johnny tossed his cigarette aside, stepped out into the street, and approached the old man. "Sure thing, old-timer. We'll help you." Jess appeared hopeful. "Help me?" "Yes, help you." Johnny led the slow-moving Jess down an alley and behind the buildings where Johnny's boys were waiting. The boys then grabbed the old man and knocked him down, and Jess hit the ground like a rock. Johnny's boys began to beat on him with hammers and pickaxes. They broke and tore the old man apart, intending to sell him for the gold. The massacre was quite loud, yet no one came to see what was happening, and no one in town seemed to hear Jess's agonized screams. Seemingly unnoticed by Johnny or his boys, Silas Gravestone stepped out of the shadows and observed the horrific act. The creepy, gaunt man stepped closer and stared coldly at Jess's broken face. Jess's terrified eyes met his, and Gravestone shook his head unsympathetically. "I told you, Mr. Cutter, greed was going to be the death of you." With that, the outlaws tore what was left of the old man apart. The commotion had settled down, and the old man's screams were silent. Jess Cutter was gone. The outlaws ran away with their loot, whooping and hollering with glee at their newfound wealth. Silas Gravestone tipped his hat in their direction. "Farewell, Mr. Cutter," Gravestone said as he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. All was now deathly quiet. The only sounds were the screeching of a circling hawk overhead and a woman's cackling laughter on the wind.